All right, we've got it started.
We want to make sure we have a record of this for those who weren't able to attend, who might have questions about our subject today. But it's great to see so many of you, either your faces or several names that I recognize. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate any of the lunch and learns that you participated in, and certainly this topic is one that has generated a lot of interest in discussions as well. So I asked if I could just have an opportunity to welcome everyone and just kind of also frame up what has brought us here, because I think that might be a question for some of you who have been involved in our community savings accounts as volunteers for a long time. Is why are things maybe changing or looking a little different? So I wanted to take an opportunity to provide a little context there. And really the whole topic of the charitable purpose and expenditure responsibility is certainly important to all of us because your work that you're doing in our communities is vital to us and is really a flagship program of the Community Foundation. And so I want to highlight, first of all, the importance of the role that you play in making sure that charitable assets can be distributed in our communities. And I know that Carly's going to go into great detail. But before we turn things over to her, I wanted to give you a little bit of background in what brought us here. You know, charitable purpose, as most of us might define it, bears a little bit different definition than what the IRS does define charitable purpose. And so that I think is a critical importance to highlight, that we're really taking, you know, our directions and instructions from how the IRS defines charitable purpose. It protects not only our donors, but all of you who are making grants and all of the end grant recipients, for us to be really clear about charitable purpose. If you've, read trade magazines or even the Wall Street Journal lately, you'll recognize that there has been increased scrutiny on a national level on charitable purpose. And particularly, we even see that Congress is taking an increased interest in the issue. There have been several bills that have made it to the floor, have made it to discussion. The most recent one would be the ACE Act. And all of those bills talk about additional restrictions placed on charitable entities and the grants that they distribute. And some of that is being driven by the advent of the commercial donor advised funds, et cetera. There's a lot more attention that's being garnered. And Congress, as well as the IRS, are looking to make sure that they're not losing out on tax dollars that could be distributed by them instead of our charitable entities. So that's kind of what's driving a lot of the attention that's growing across the country and certainly legislatively. Community foundations are trying to stay ahead of that issue. And we're looking for an exemption actually in some of that legislation from a standpoint of the most restrictive policies. It would not apply to the definition of charitable purpose, but we're hoping that we can make the case with our legislators that the time frame for distributions and other very, very restrictive practices that they're considering would not apply to community foundations, because of course our work is not only about now, today, it's about long into the future. So we're trying to, as a group, as an entity, community foundations across the country are trying to stay ahead of the issue. And a lot of that comes in conjunction with some self-regulation, right? So if we can demonstrate community foundations' willingness to adhere to standards and to comply proactively with anything dealing with charitable purpose, then we can make the case that we're not the entities that they should be concerned about, that they can scrutinize additionally with other restrictive practices, other entities that have not proven themselves to be as vigilant about making sure we're adhering to all the IRS practices that we are. We have been accredited as a community foundation that participates in national standards. We have had that accreditation for nearly 18 years. This is just one topic of a myriad of topics that we have to comply with to maintain our good standing in national standards. You'll notice if you're on our website that seal of approval and having comply with national standards is there. It is among all the other community foundations that operate in South Dakota and most of our cohorts. So it's important that we're able to continue to be in compliance with national standards. It assures, first of all, that we're meeting those guidelines that allow donors to take a charitable deduction for their gift. And I think that's especially reassuring to those donors that you're working with in your community. They want to assure that whether they're making current gifts, business gifts, estate gifts, that they're going to be assured the deductibility and not be faced with a tax mess down the road. And so complying with those standards helps assure that. Our board has been very active and been kept apprised of all of the evolution in these conversations and have maintained the importance of complying, of course, with IRS regulations and national standards. And so that conversation was again had in May. And so they understand how we're proceeding and what requirements that we need to adhere to. So if you had a chance to talk to them, they're very well aware of these conversations and how things are shifting a little bit, and that we're just our hand is forced in that area. So my hope at the end of this time together and the information that Carly is going to go through, that we really leave with a better understanding of the process that we have here in moving forward with the grant requests that you send in. We want to be really clear about that flow, that workflow, so to speak, so you understand exactly where it lands, where it goes, and what time frame that you can expect us to deal with any request that's not going out directly to a verified charitable entity. We also want you to understand that we want to work with you however we can to allow the work that you're being done to continue. And so I know our development team and the staff in the office are very proactive in keeping you informed about where we are in the process and where we might have a stumbling block, because the entity that you're requesting a distribution to go to is not, as the IRS defines it, a charitable entity. We recognize also, we want everyone to understand that just as in the past, we can always still partner with any verified charitable entity. That includes verified 501c3s, and we have a system in here that when we get a tax ID number, we can easily attain their verified status, and we can substantiate that. It also includes any governmental entity, that's city, county, state governmental entity. They are by their very nature verified charitable entities. It also includes schools and churches. So I would encourage our boards to engage them on the front end as a potential partner in the work that's being done, because by doing that, we could potentially avoid the additional steps that are required to establish the charitable purpose that Carly is going to get into. So I just wanted to kind of preface that, because this isn't new. It's something that continues to evolve, and something that we recognize that it might mean for some of you that you are unable to make distributions to an entity that you've typically made grants directly to. And that's where we want to work proactively with you to identify other partners that could perhaps allow us to move forward with those before these other intervening circumstances. So with that all being said, I know Jamie has a few housekeeping issues that she's going to cover before Carly gets her presentation underway. And thanks again for being here today.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll wait for Carly to bring up my first slide here to kind of cover some of the housekeeping items. We do have everyone on mute right now, so do feel free, through the presentation. We do have time for questions at the end. So I'll wait till I think you'll have to change your display settings there, Carly.
Oh, is it coming up wrong again?
Yeah, it is.
There we go.
Okay, so everyone is muted right now, but we've got time at the end for questions. So either, wait till the end, or you can unmute yourself to ask those. And I will be monitoring the chat box, so that if you have any questions, please just plug those in there, and I'll make sure that we get those answered at the end. And we are recording this session, so we would love it if after this, we'll make this available to everyone, and you can share that out with your other advisory council members that weren't able to attend today. So with that, I will give it over to you, Carly.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. As both Stephanie and Jamie have said, my name is Carly Winter. I'm the Operations and Compliance Manager here at the South Dakota Community Foundation. I know I've visited with a few of you who are on the call in the past, probably about expenditure responsibility. I'm an attorney by trade, and so I'm going to try my best not to over-explain and talk your ear off today, and rather give sort of an overview and some helpful tips. But today's roadmap, we're going to talk a little bit about expenditure responsibility generally right away. Then we're going to review CSA grant making requirements. We're going to delve a little bit more deeply into what exactly is a verified organization, discuss a bit about the IRS definition of charitable purpose. If you're interested in a little bit more in-depth information on that, we did do a lunch and learn last November, and that's available for you to watch if you want some further in-depth explanation of charitable purpose. So today is just going to be an overview. We're going to talk about what the expenditure responsibility process will look like at SDCF. We're going to talk about some common problematic grants that you might encounter. We're going to discuss some other grant roadblocks that are maybe potentially related to expenditure responsibility, but how to avoid things that might otherwise slow up your granting process, and then some suggested best practices. I also have to give the fine print disclaimer that the information that we present today is general information. It's not intended to constitute legal advice, because each granting situation is fact specific. So it's impossible to give advice today generally that will cover all situations. So no attorney-client relationship is formed by your viewing or attendance of this presentation. So what is expenditure responsibility? The Council on Foundations is an organization, a national organization, that's sort of a good resource for private and community foundations. Their definition is sort of a broader definition, and they're saying that expenditure responsibility is the federally mandated procedure that a private foundation and some public charities must follow for any grant made to an organization that is not a public charity. And for purposes of today, when we talk about public charities or verified organizations, or reference 501c3s, I'm going to be talking about those organizations that are 501c3s, but that's also including churches, schools, government entities, and the like that are treated as verified public charities. So the Council on Foundations further says that, as an example, a foundation can make a grant to any type of legitimate organization anywhere in the world. And they give the example of a casino in Monte Carlo. If you want to think about an organization that that makes money for their own private purposes, a casino in Monte Carlo is probably a pretty great example. But that grant could be made so long as that grant is strictly for charitable purposes and the foundation is prepared to take on additional requirements. So that's what we're looking at with expenditure responsibility. The IRS has its own definition. It's a little bit more procedural. It kind of sets out the steps. Essentially, the foundation needs to make sure that the grant money is spent only for the purposes for which the grant was originally made. So if you tell us you're going to spend the money to plant trees in the public park, we need to make sure that you're actually planting trees in the public park. Then obtain full and complete reports from the grantee organization on how those funds are spent. That's to ensure that step one is completed. And then step three is really an SDCF activity, making those full and detailed reports to the IRS. The background on expenditure responsibility for community foundations really starts with the Paycheck Protection Act a few years ago. There was some expenditure responsibility required for private foundations prior to that, but the Paycheck Protection Act ended up requiring that public charities also use expenditure responsibility if making a grant from a donor advised fund, if that grant was going to an entity that wasn't a 501c3 public charity. Here at SDCF, our CSA funds are sort of a donor advised field of interest fund hybrid. So it's a little unclear how the law, the IRS would see our CSA funds. The Council on Foundations has made best practice recommendations for public charities, and that's to follow all requirements for private foundations. That's the only way to ensure that we are in compliance. And I will say other community foundations avoid the problem of this question by restricting grants from affiliate funds, which is what a lot of other community foundations call CSAs, to only 501c3 charitable organizations. Now, South Dakota is a little bit different than maybe some of the larger community foundations in other areas. We're a rural state, we have fewer people. Fewer people mean fewer nonprofits. Fewer nonprofits mean even fewer 501c3 granting opportunities. And we know our CSA partners want to make sure that the money that you raise stays in your communities and is spent in your communities. And when we have fewer 501c3 organizations to take that money, expenditure responsibility is the way we can still accomplish those grants that you want to make, while still making sure that we're in compliance with IRS regulations. Now, the Community Foundation has some of its own responsibilities. I'll go through this briefly because a lot of it you'll already know. Prudent fund management, when we discuss that, we're referencing largely making sure our investments are sound and responsible, that our expenditures that we're allowing out of funds the fund's not going to outspend its lifelong plan, that those funds are in compliance with IRS and state guidelines. We also have the responsibility to exercise due diligence in grant making. What that means generally is grants from all funds only go to verified 501c3 and like organizations. Of course, as we're discussing today, CSAs are excepted from that rule. All grants must be made for an exclusively charitable purpose. That applies across the board. And then maintaining, I guess, guidelines for the CSAs that operate under our 501c3 umbrella. If we aren't making sure that our CSA grant making is in compliance, we jeopardize our charitable status, which puts those CSA funds and all of our other funds at risk. Additionally, fund agreements that were signed by all fund holders when a fund is started indicates that gifts to the South Dakota Community Foundation are irrevocable and they become the property of SDCF. The SDCF board assumes, as the fund agreement language says, absolute and ultimate authority and control over all gifts. And that's an IRS rule that allows those charitable gifts to qualify for a tax deduction for CSA and other fund donors. The flip side of all of this absolute and ultimate authority and control is also all of the responsibility to make sure that we are in compliance and that we are exercising due diligence, but also allowing these grants to continue to be made. So as to CSA grant making requirements, for the most part, CSAs can freely grant you, as we've said, IRS verified tax exempt organizations, usually 501c3s, churches, schools, and recognized units of government. And the reason the IRS recognizes churches, schools, and units of government as quasi 501c3 charitable organizations is that the IRS assumes that there's oversight built into those organizations. Generally, there's a board that oversees a church or a school, a city council or a county commission, to oversee how those public funds or church funds are used. And so there's more, the IRS gives a little bit more leeway because they assume someone else is overseeing how those grant funds would be spent as well. Now, CSAs can grant to tax exempt organizations, or that should be nonprofit organizations that are not 501c3s, so 501c6s or 501c7s, or unverified organizations, but additional oversight is required, and that's what we're talking about today. So what is a verified organization? Organizations are determined to be verified by the IRS. That determination comes from the IRS. And that determination, when we say determination, it pertains to whether the organization is exempt from federal income taxes under 501c3 of the IRS code. Additionally, you have to prove to the IRS that you're organized for exclusively one or more charitable purposes. We'll discuss charitable purposes a little bit more in depth in a bit. And those same guidelines are used to make decisions about whether or not an individual grant has a charitable purpose. Well, further on what is a verified organization, I included this quote. It's a mess because this whole situation is kind of a mess. There's a lot of confusion around what is a nonprofit versus what is a tax exempt versus what is a charitable organization. And I think this quote, which came from a textbook on charitable taxation, sort of captures that essence pretty well. So what makes an organization verified? Well, it's not just calling yourself a nonprofit organization. So I can start, Carly's fund for children's school supplies, and I can collect money from all my friends and neighbors, and I can use all that money to buy school supplies and give them away to kids. And I'm essentially a nonprofit organization because I've not used that money to benefit myself. But I'm not an IRS verified charitable nonprofit organization that would qualify for a free grant from SDCF or CSA. It's also not just obtaining an EIN, that would be an employer identification number, also known as a federal tax ID number. Those numbers come from the IRS. They're used, it's basically a social security number for a business, but there's no special tax status or 501c3 type status conveyed with that EIN. It's also not just registering as a nonprofit corporation with the state of South Dakota. Now, doing so may entitle you to exemptions from state taxes, but doesn't exempt you from federal taxes and doesn't convey any type of special nonprofit status from the federal government, from the IRS. I will say that if you have an organization or are an organization that's interested in obtaining your 501c3 verified status, steps basically 2 and 3, the EIN and the registration with the state of South Dakota as a nonprofit are part of that process. Those are steps 1 and 2 in the process of obtaining your 501c3. So they're not bad per se, they're just not what we need to make those freely made grants. A verified organization requires approval from the IRS. Entities who've received their IRS verification have filed IRS Form 1023 or 1023-EZ, which is a shortened version of that form. They've identified that organization's overall charitable purpose, explained that, justified it to the IRS, and then the IRS responds by assigning a tax exempt status or not, which may be a 501c3 status, a different type of 501c nonprofit, and that information comes via determination letter. So any organization that has received verification from the IRS as a 501c3 nonprofit will have a letter that looks like this, an IRS determination letter. And I've blown up the little section in the right corner so you can see it a little bit better. This is actually a South Dakota organization's letter. I've blacked them out so as not to embarrass them or call anyone out, but this was an effective date of January 22nd, 2018. That little box up there will give the EIN, so that should match up with your organization's information. Public charity status, the numbers listed under there, the 170B1A6 are, it's another section of the IRS code that indicates nonprofit status. The other information, Form 990 is required. That's a tax form that would be important to know. First and second paragraphs of the letter are also informative, where the IRS indicates that the organization has been identified as tax exempt under section 501c3. The second paragraph also further clarifies that the organization has been recognized as a public charity. So anytime you're talking about a 501c3 verified organization, this is the key to that status right here. Now, the IRS may give you the 501c3 nonprofit status, or it might assign a different type of nonprofit status. And you'll see some of these in your grant making as well. We see a lot of 501c4s, volunteer fire departments, that kind of thing. We see 501c7s, which are recreational clubs. 501c10s are fraternal orders. C13s are cemeteries, and C19s are veterans groups, so your VFW and your Legion. These organizations are nonprofits, but they're not charities. So a grant can be made to them so long as charitable purpose is present and expenditure responsibility is exercised. In order to make those grants to the non-501c3 organizations, there are two main steps. So the first is when you get the distribution request form or the grant application from your grantee, we need to verify charitable purpose. And that's something that's SDCF's ultimate responsibility to do. And then utilize the expenditure responsibility process. In truth, this process for the most part, is already occurring. It just has been happening in the background. When we get your distribution request forms, we look them over to make sure that there's some semblance of charitable purpose there. And then you participate in the expenditure responsibility process at this point by having your grantees fill out the grant acceptance form and then sending back the grant evaluation form at the end. What's changing now is that we're going to have to ask for potentially some documentation, and we'll have to do a little bit more investigation just to make sure that this process is documented, so that if the need ever arose, if the IRS was questioning one of our grants, we had that documentation and we could prove that we had done that due diligence to make sure that that grant was a good grant. So what is a charitable purpose? On the right, you'll see the IRS definition of charitable purpose. I put it on there so you can see what it looks like. I don't expect anyone to read through that in this form or understand off the bat. I just wanted you to see what the actual language of the IRS definition of charitable purposes. For your benefit, SDCF has broken out this IRS guidance into a more easily digestible infographic sheet, which looks like this, and which I'm guessing many of you have probably seen. This is the same information in that paragraph. It just breaks each category out and explains and gives some examples. So I think it's a little bit more easily digestible, a little bit more helpful. If you would like a copy of this charitable purpose infographic, you can certainly have one. Just let us know so you don't have to try to read it tiny off of this slide. For further, more easily digestible purposes, out of those 8 categories, there are some categories that are going to be more commonly used than others. The primary charitable purpose categories we see in grants that come from CSAs are religious, educational, prevention of cruelty to children or animals, and then the charitable generally category, which the IRS further breaks down into additional categories. And a lot of your community grants are going to fall under this charitable generally category. Again, if you want more explanation on the charitable purpose categories or how your potential grants might fit, you can take a look, take a watch at that Lunch and Learn from last year, or give us a call. The expenditure responsibility process for our community savings accounts is gonna be pretty similar to how it is now. The due diligence on the front side of the granting process is going to be the grant application. I think most of our CSAs are using grant applications. If you aren't at this point, we have a template that you can use so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is a helpful way to get a detailed description of the project and how the funds will be used. I know in smaller communities, it's really easy to just verbally discuss a project and how much money is needed and then fill out the distribution forms. But part of that documentation process that we need to flesh out here is getting that project description and funding requests down on paper so that we can match up at the end of the project and match up the evaluation with the initial grant application to make sure that the funds that were given were the funds that were supposed to be given and that they were used how they were intended to be used. This is the step where additional documentation may be requested. So some of you have probably gotten calls from us asking for more information on the organization's charitable status, or who owns the property, or what public benefit will there be from this project. Some of the follow-up will be questions that you can just ask your grantee and find out. We also might be asking for additional documentation at certain times. We've got the little asterisk on the end of that. In most cases, the additional work required will be quite minimal. I can't say that for every situation, but for the most part, it's just a question or two that we need to have answered. Step 2 then will be the grant acceptance form. This is already something that's part of the process. And I want to emphasize that that grant acceptance form shouldn't go out until the grant is approved. It avoids a lot of heartache. If you don't send out the grant acceptance form until after the grant is approved, it's harder to go back and say, well, you signed the grant acceptance, but now there's some issues. So once the grant is approved, the grantee will sign, and that document indicates the grantees agreeing to the terms of the grant, which includes the expenditure responsibility process, and also outlines what happens if, or what should happen if a grant extension is needed, or a change to the grant needs to be made. And then step 3 is the final step in the process, and that's the grant expenditure evaluation form. That form should be returned to SDCF within 60 days of the project's completion. That will have to include an itemized list of expenses, again, so we can make sure that the way the money was spent matches up with the original description of the project and how the funds were to be used. Some common grants to watch out for. So these are some grants that we have had come through in the last year. They're pretty common, that cause us a little bit of heartburn. Volunteer fire departments are a big one, because most volunteer fire departments are not 501c3s, even though it seems like they should be. We're prevented from freely granting to them, even though there's a pretty clear public benefit much of the time. For volunteer fire departments, we can usually make grants for public safety type equipment or training, fire safety prevention training, AEDs, new trucks, and that kind of public safety equipment. The problem comes in because volunteer fire departments usually also have a membership or sort of fraternal component, a social component. And so the IRS wants to make sure that the funds that go to these types of organizations are used for public safety and not used to fund the volley yearly spring dance or whatever it is. Similar concerns with the American Legion VFW ARI type grants. There's a membership social component with those organizations as well, even though in a lot of towns in South Dakota, those organizations are sort of sometimes the public center, the community center that everyone uses. We've had grants come through in the last couple months to say improvements at the American Legion. And in general, those grants won't work. But if, for example, for an American Legion, improvements to the kitchen or something along those lines, if we can show that the Legion building allows community members to the Legion organization allows community members to use the building for free of charge. So there's really a public benefit involved there. That makes that grant a little bit more charitable. We can probably find a way to make it work. Chambers of Commerce and Economic Development Corporations, again, these are not automatic no's. They're just grants we have to be a little bit more careful with, because a lot of times there's benefit to private business. And we need to be careful about private benefit. That's one big no-no in the public charity world, is that grants can't be made that would inure a private benefit to an individual. Membership in recreational organizations, similarly to volunteer fire departments and legions, there's a membership dues usually required to belong to a country club or an archery club or a knitting club. So even though there may be some educational purpose or benefit to these clubs, because they're not open to the public, they're not strictly a public, it's not strictly a public benefit. Now, again, like the American Legion situation, we've had recreational organizations who offer free lessons to children or free use of the facilities to members of the public. In some of those situations, we can sometimes work around that benefit or that prohibition on private benefit. And then grants to cemeteries are also sometimes problematic. The IRS wants to avoid that private benefit issue with cemeteries as well. So there are specific criteria or specific set of ways that grants to cemeteries can be used. And essentially it's for upkeep of historical monuments or headstones. So, if Abraham Lincoln's tombstone is sinking, grant money could be used because there's a public benefit to upkeep of that headstone. But average Joe's grandma's headstone wouldn't qualify under that historical purpose, as long as she's just another average person. Those monies for cemeteries can be used for upkeep and general maintenance, so mowing, fences, things to keep the whole entire cemetery up and running might also qualify. But there's a specific list that would be available to you if you had questions on that type of grant. Other granting roadblocks to avoid, as I discussed a bit in the last slide, there's a prohibition on private benefits. And one of the most common examples that's given in a lot of the reading material, the guidance on this topic, is a actual case law where an art gallery that was put together by several artists with the intent that they would show their own work, and then their own work could be for sale. So there's definitely an educational arts benefit to an organization like that. However, the IRS did deny them an exemption as a 501c3 organization because they determined that it was more likely that the artists would personally benefit by promoting the sales of their own artwork, even though there was some incidental public benefit. So that's just an example of the private benefit prohibition. Another way the private benefit issue comes up is grants to individuals. I don't think we see many requests for personal fundraisers. Let's say a family loses a home in a fire, or an individual has medical bills from a health diagnosis. Those would be prohibited because that would be a grant strictly to an individual. The kind of shadier way or a more incognito way this type of issue would come up would be requests for improvements to privately owned property that might seem quasi-public. So recently we had an issue where we got a grant request from a movie theater, a local movie theater, to improve their marquee. According to the information we could find, the movie theater was owned by some private individuals. And so their question then was, if we, even though it's a commonly used community space in a small town, and everyone wants to see the theater do well, if it's privately owned, we're making improvements to privately owned property, then there's a private benefit there. We were able to clarify with that organization that at some point the last owners had sold the theater to a nonprofit group whose goal was to keep the theater running for the residents of the town. So there was no one who was benefiting privately from those proceeds from the running of the theater, and so that grant was approved. And finally, one issue we've been seeing is making sure the EIN matches up. So when you're filling out a grant application or a grant distribution request, please make sure that the employer identification number you're using matches up with the organization listed as the grantee. We've seen a couple come in where an organization that wouldn't be a 501c3 but is maybe affiliated with a 501c3 uses an EIN that would be a 501c3, but then when we check the EIN, it comes up as a different organization. Then we have to go back and ask, what's going on? What's the story here? I don't think it'll be common, but we have run into a situation or two where the organization whose EIN is being used doesn't know or didn't give approval for their EIN to be used. And that's something we definitely want to avoid. We don't want to be granting to organizations who didn't know they asked for the grant or that they received the grant. So making sure that those match up will also shorten your wait time when you're making grants. Some other suggested best practices: if you have questions about grants, whether or not you can make them, just call us first. We have development people in just about every corner of the state, ready and eager to answer your questions on how you can make these grants. I'm here at the foundation. You can call me as well, although I'd recommend calling your development person first. Additionally, it's easiest to extend these grants to 501c3 and similar type organizations. We realize that's not always possible, but as Stephanie said to start out this presentation, 501c3 organizations, churches, schools, and units of government can always accept those types of grants. We recommend that you use a grant application as part of your granting process. That will also prevent us from having to come back after we've received your distribution request forms to ask what exactly is this grant for, since it's being made to a non-501c3 organization. If you use your own grant application, meaning if you've made up your own rather than using SDCF's template, make sure there's a section where it asks the grantee to describe their project and how they intend to use the money. Another way to sort of speed up the grant process for an unverified organization is to just go ahead and send that grant application along with the distribution request. If you have a distribution request, that contains requests for organizations that aren't churches, schools, units of government, or 501c3s, just go ahead and send that grant application right along with it, because that will eliminate the step of us having to come back and ask for it. Another suggestion, as I mentioned earlier, is to not announce grants or inform grantees that they've received a grant until all the grants have been approved. I don't anticipate it happening often, but it's possible that some grants that have been made in the past, or grants to some grantees, depending on the purpose of the grant, could be affected by this policy. Denials of grants may happen, but they will be rare. Since we started sort of phasing in this procedure roughly a year ago, I think there's been less than a handful of grants that we haven't been able to make work or find a way to make a charitable purpose be present. In full disclosure, denials of grants may happen, but I do think that it will be pretty rare. We want you to be able to spend the money that you've raised for your community. And again, if you have questions that are not answered by this presentation, please feel free to give us a call first. I do see some chat questions here.
Yeah, I think we've got one from Jim. His question is, per avoiding grants to individuals, can you further explain how a scholarship grant doesn't fall into this area?
That's good question. Yep. Different rules for scholarships. That's a whole nother presentation that maybe Kelly Nelson, our scholarship person, can give someday. But essentially, education is the charitable purpose involved there. And the way our scholarship program works, we're not sending the money directly to the individual student. The money goes to the institution of higher learning. And so there's a whole nother section of IRS code that pertains to scholarships. So.
Great, thanks, Carly. And Dean, yes, I will be making Carly's slides available. I will email that to all the attendees so that you can share that with your advisory council members. So you'll have both the slides and this presentation recording.
As I said, if you have any questions, here are your local development officer contacts. Most of you already know these folks pretty well. My contact information is on the bottom there. This slide will be included. So this will be part of the presentation. And again, thank you. Appreciate any other questions. Jamie, I'm going to stop sharing.
Sure.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we can see everybody.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any additional questions for Carly? We really appreciate her experience and expertise in this area. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Jamie?
Yes, Ron. Hi.
Yes. Does the individual board have any discretion on a change of a grant? And for an example, we gave a grant to the local library for a program that they were going to sponsor, and then it was canceled because of the virus. And they did reuse it for something else for the children. Is this something that we have a discretion on, or is it something that we have to ask permission for?
I can take that one, Jamie. We're revamping our forms that we're going to use for this process. There is a line item in that grant acceptance policy that the grantee signs now. We're going to try to make it a little bit more obvious in our revamping. In that sense, as long as there's a charitable purpose, it's fine if that grant is reused, but we need to have a little bit of documentation. So it's as long as there's still a charitable purpose, it's really procedural and sort of some paperwork. But that's one thing we have to be able to show the IRS that we were made aware of the change of the grant purpose and that we have some documentation to back it up. So that grant acceptance form will sort of outline the general process of if you're unable to spend the money for whatever reason for the purpose that was identified when the grant was made, there will be a form for grant return or grant amendments that the organization can fill out and send back to us and let us approve.
So we'll have to ask for a form, is that correct?
Yep.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Ron.
Good question.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.
Well, it doesn't look like it. So
you know where to find us.
right. If you have any questions after this, I know it's a lot of information. Feel free to reach out to the development team, to your development officer, or give us a call here in the office. And we're always happy to talk through any granting ideas that you might have. So, all right.
All right.
Well, I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for
Bye-bye.
attending, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, Janet.